Before we get into the lesson, if you would, let's bow and have a word of prayer. If you would, let's have a prayer. Our Father in heaven, we come before Thee at this time, thanking Thee for this Lord's Day. We're thankful for the opportunity that we have this morning to come together and to study Your Word. And we pray, Father, that as we enter into this Bible study, that You would help us to dismiss all the cares and thoughts of this world and focus our minds upon Your Word, and help us to take this story that we're going to study about today and make the right applications in our lives. We ask that You would be with those of our number that are not here, those of our number that are sick. We pray that You would restore their health and bring them back to us at the next appointed time. We ask that You would go with us now, watch over us, and be with us throughout the remainder exercises of this day. Forgive us of our sins. It's our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, we are in lesson 25 of the workbook, and we're going to be studying Acts chapter 27. So at the end of our lesson last week, you might remember Festus had asked Agrippa to come and hear the case of Paul so that he might provide some advice on what to write to Caesar regarding the charges against Paul. And after hearing the case, Agrippa, Bernice, and Festus talked about it for a while, and they all agreed that Paul had done nothing worthy of imprisonment, nothing worthy of death. Agrippa said that Paul actually might have been set free had he not appealed to Caesar. And so Paul should have been set free by Felix, by Festus, but now it was too late. Paul had appealed to Caesar, and there's no taking it back. So Paul must go to Caesar, and Paul must go to Rome for Caesar to hear the case now. And so our lesson this week it's about Paul's journey to Rome. And while it details the journey and the experiences that he has on going to Rome, there are some lessons that can apply to us and our lives, and I'll try to touch on a few of those this morning as we go through our lesson. But at the end, if we have some time, I'd like for us to talk about some of those things, some lessons that we can apply. So as we're going through, be thinking about that. What lessons can we take from this story? What application is there for us that we can apply to our lives? So let's go ahead and begin our reading. Let's read Acts 27, and let's read the first 12 verses. Acts 27, verse 1. And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. And the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. When we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. When we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lasea. Now, when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there. So it's now time for Paul to go to Rome. And so Paul is going with some other prisoners to Rome, and there's a centurion named Julius that's in charge of taking them there. And so they're all put on a ship, and they intended to sail along the coast of Asia. And, sailing along the coast is a pretty common way to sail during the winter months. The Mediterranean is tough sailing in the winter, and so hugging the coast was pretty common during that time. Verse 3 says that they landed in Sidon, and we're told Julius, he's the centurion that was in charge, says he treated Paul with kindness and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. And I take this to mean that there were Christians in the area that came and were able to see Paul, even though Paul's a prisoner. They were allowed to see Paul and care for him. And we see the weather is growing increasingly worse. Okay, and the journey from Myra to Fair Havens is going very slow. Because of that time of the year. It says that the fast, it's after the fast, and this fast that's referring to is a Day of Atonement. And this Day of Atonement was around September or October, and so it's winter. It's late in the year. It's a dangerous time to be on the Mediterranean. Okay, so in verse 10 we see Paul warns them that he perceives this voyage will end in disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also their lives. So, Paul warns them, but the centurion, Julius, he doesn't listen to Paul. He takes the advice of the pilot of the ship and the owner of the ship. And so they decide they're going to sail on. Against the advice of Paul, they're going to sail on. And so the scripture reveals there's several reasons for them not wanting to stay there in Fair Havens. Verse 12 says the harbor was not suitable for them to winter in. So it's an exposed harbor, and the majority didn't want to stay there. They wanted to move on. They wanted to try to sail and get to a place called Phoenix, which, there's a harbor there. That's better the way that it faces. It says it opened toward the southwest and northwest, and they thought that it was a better place for them to winter. And so they went against the advice of Paul, and they tried to sail on from there and make it to Phoenix. Anybody have any thoughts or comments on this section? Yes, Paul.
I don't think we realized how hard it was in that period of time to go in a ship someplace.
Right.
Now we think we ought to go on a ship, start the motor up and go, but it didn't work that way.
Well, and I'll tell you, there's a man in here that has some experience with that. And Bill, I don't know if you want to comment. Bill spent some time in the Navy and spent some time on some modern ships in the Mediterranean, and it's pretty rough, wasn't it, Bill?
It is. That's some of, other than the North Atlantic, that's some of the roughest water we sailed in. And I sailed through it about the same time as Paul did. Late summer, early winter, and we got into a big storm, and it was bad.
And the weather can change on a dime, from my
All the time.
understanding.
We didn't know it when we left. Got out there, and it was bad.
Yeah.
That was a motorized vehicle, a motorized
Right.
boat, a variable.
It was a destroyer, 376 foot long. I think they sailed, their ships were 20 or 30 foot long, a lot of difference.
Yeah.
I don't know how they did it.
Yeah. Well, and, we're going to see, here in just a minute, we're going to just see how bad it gets and how quickly things can change, and something that they try to do, when things get rough out there. But anybody have anything else before we move on to the next section? Okay, let's, this is gonna be kind of a lengthy reading here, but, if someone would read verses 13 through 38. So Acts 27, verses 13 through 38, and then we'll talk about those passages.
And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosened thence, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after they arose again in a tempestuous wind called Eurolidae. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up under the wind, we let it arrive. And running under a certain island, which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps, undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands, strike sail, and so were driven. And we were exceedingly tossed with a tempest. The next day they lightened the ship, and the third day we cast out our own hands the tackling of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. But after long absence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, you should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosened from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. Howbeit, we must be cast upon a certain island. But when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria, about midnight the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country, and sounded and found it 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they sounded again and found it 15 fathoms. Then fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern, and wished for the day. And as the shipmen were about to flee from the ship, when they had laid down the boat into the sea, under color as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, Except these abide in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, This day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. Is that
Through 38.
Oh, wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. For there shall not a hair fall from the head of any of you. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread, and gave thanks to God in presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then were they all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. And we were in all the ship 213 souls. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea.
Okay, thank you.
And when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, unto the which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. Did I go?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, go ahead and stop there. Yeah, just through 38. But thank you for reading that. But so in verse 13, we see that the wind seems favorable to them. It says it's blowing from the south. And so it seemed good. They thought that it was good for them to travel. They could start their travel. They thought they could make it. So they pulled up the anchors and, they're sailing close to the shore of Crete. But the weather changed, abruptly. It says a typhoon's strength of wind came. It's called a Uraquilo, I think is what they called it, but it's a typhoon strength of wind, and it drove them off course. I think one version I read called it a northeaster type of a storm, but extremely high winds were blowing them off course, and it was blowing them away from the land. It was blowing them out to sea. The sailors couldn't turn the ship into the wind, so really they gave up. They kind of gave up, and they just let the wind take it to where that it would take it. And then in verse 16, they were able to sail along a sheltered side of a small island named Cauda. And they were able, there was a lifeboat that they were trailing, it was trailing behind them that they were towing. They were able to lift that lifeboat up and get it into the ship. And then I don't really understand, Bill may be able to explain this better, but it says then they bound ropes around the hull to strengthen it. They feared that the ship would be driven across some of these sandbars, so they lowered the anchor down to slow the ship down. And then in verse 18, it's the next day, the gale force winds continued to batter the ship. And so what the crew began to do was start throwing some of the cargo overboard. The storm raged for many days. It says they couldn't see the sun and the stars. Really, all hope was gone for them. But then in verse 21, Paul speaks up. He calls the crew together. No one had eaten for a long time. And he tells them first, they should have listened to him to begin with and should not have left Crete. This is the kind of I told you so, moment, but if they had listened, they could have avoided all this damage, this loss. But then he tells them in verse 22 to be of good courage, that there will be no loss of life. They're going to lose the ship, but nobody's going to die. And then in verse 23, he says this was revealed to him by God, the one who he belongs to, the one that he serves. He was told by God to not be afraid, and that Paul must go before Caesar, and so no one's going to be harmed in this. Paul nor anyone else sailing with him is going to be harmed. God in his goodness is granting safety to everyone that's sailing with him. Paul says he goes on to say he believes in God, he believes God, and that it will be just as God said. They will be shipwrecked on an island, but no one's going to lose their life. And then in verse 27, it says it was about midnight on the 14th night. They were being driven across the sea. The sailors, they sensed that land was near, so they dropped a weighted line to find out how deep the water was. The water was about 120 feet deep. A little later, they tested it again. They found the water to only be 90 feet deep, so it's getting shallower, so they know that land is getting closer. And so then they became afraid that they were going to be, the ship was going to, be thrown against some rocks and along the shore. So they threw out 4 anchors from the back of the ship and, trying to, get to daylight where they could see the land. So they threw out these 4 anchors from the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. And then in verse 39, we see that some sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered that lifeboat down that they had pulled up before. They lowered it down. They were going to try to abandon the ship and get into this lifeboat. But then Paul, tells them, tells the commanding officer and the soldiers that if they do this, they're going to die. And so this time they listened. They cut the ropes of the lifeboat and let it drift away. And so then in verse 33, the day was dawning, and Paul was encouraging everyone to eat. They had not eaten in a while, and they needed to eat something for their own good. He reassures them again that not a hair on their head will perish. And then in verse 35, we see they took some bread, that Paul took some bread, broke it off a piece and ate, and then he encouraged everyone to eat. And we see that there were 276 people on board. So then after eating, it says the crew lightened the ship further, throwing the cargo of wheat overboard. And so I'm not a sailor, but I was trying to do a little research. You know, what's the purpose of throwing the stuff off board? Maybe y'all think that y'all know it, and maybe you do. But from what I read, you know, heavy cargo, you know, it causes a ship to sink down. You know, obviously it sits lower in the water, and so it takes on more water. You know, which you know is harder on the ship. Also, with the cargo, you know, it's shifting. You know, with the turbulence and stuff, the shifting cargo causes it to lean over to one side or another. You know, a heavier ship is slower to recover from those rolls, and so it's easier to control the ship. You know, and get it up sitting higher. Takes less of a beating if you'll throw the cargo off the vessel. It improves the stability, reduces the strain, recovers better from the rolls. And so it was a practice that was used and a practice that's been used for centuries, actually. And I think it's still relevant today. But that was the purpose for throwing over the cargo. But anybody have any thoughts or comments? Yes, Bill.
I've got two things there. On the binding of the hull, those old wooden ships could not take the wave action because they would twist and turn like this and actually loosen the boards of the hull of the ship. So they would take and pass ropes under the ship and then tie them to help hold it together.
I see.
And the throwing the cargo over, that's always the last resort before you sink. That's the last thing a captain wants to do is get rid of what was going to make him the money for this.
Mm-hmm.
But it's better to get rid of it than to sink, so that's what they did.
Yeah. So they knew they were in trouble, you know, and this
That's
was
the last thing you do before you go down.
very good. Appreciate that. Anybody have anything else there? Any other comments?
I just can't get away from 276 people on this small craft with cargo and trying to go about what they're doing in this sea, in this rough sea. You know, let alone, like Bill said, the cargo sliding back and forth, you said it sliding back and forth. You got people sliding back and forth.
Oh, yeah.
And the chance of knocking each other off of the ship and everything else too, so.
Right.
So many risks.
Right. Yep. Yes.
I have to laugh a little bit. Most of those people on that ship were not sailors.
Right.
And when you get in, even sailors get sick when the water gets that bad.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine the sick people that are absolutely useless to help support the crew?
Yeah.
They're just in the way.
Yeah. Well, that kind of reminds me of something that I did in my reading. You know, you're right. Most of these people were not, you know, experienced sailors. But at this time, Paul had been on several journeys. He had been on some ships. He had learned a thing or two, and knew he knew that they probably shouldn't be out there, and gave them that warning that we really shouldn't be out here. But you know, they didn't listen. They didn't listen.
And that's probably partially why they didn't eat either. Knowing they were going to get sick.
Yeah, you didn't think of that. Okay, let's go ahead and read on further. Let's read verses 39 through 44. So Acts 27, verse 39. When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship, if possible. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea. Meanwhile, loosing the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violent waves. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. So in verse 39, morning had dawned, and they saw the coastline, but they didn't recognize where they were at. They didn't recognize the island. They saw a bay with a beach, and they wondered if they could get to shore by just running the ship aground. So they let the anchors go. There was no reason to pull them up. They just cut the anchors and left them in sea. Then it says that they loosed the rudder ropes, hoisted the mainsail to the wind, and headed for shore. But they hit something. It says where two seas met. Some other reading says they think it was a reef. They hit some sort of reef or something like that, and they ran the ship into the ground, and the ship became stuck. It was unmovable. And so, when it gets stuck and unmovable, it just sits there and gets battered by the waves. And so it starts to break up. It gets broken. And it says the stern was being broken up by the violent waves. And so at this point, they know that the ship's going down, they're stuck, it's going to be broke up. And so they have all these prisoners, and so they decide they're going to kill the prisoners so they didn't escape. But in verse 43, the centurion stops them. He wants to save Paul. He ordered those who could swim to go ahead and jump overboard and swim to land. Those that couldn't swim, he told them to find parts of the boat, boards, whatever, something that floats, and then they can, float safely to land. And so, just as God said would happen, they all escaped safely to land, and no one perished. I thought a little bit about this centurion who wanted to save Paul. Anybody have any thoughts on why this centurion might have wanted to save Paul?
I think it was a part of the Roman law that if your prisoner escaped, you had to take his place. So it could very well be that he was afraid that he was going to be the prisoner.
Yeah, and that's true. Yeah, Rick, did you have something?
Yeah, maybe he probably knew that Paul was a Roman citizen. And Roman citizens get different treatment than non-Roman citizens got when they were in prison.
Yeah.
And he was trying to keep himself in good graces with Caesar or whoever it might be, because Paul was a Roman citizen and a pretty influential one at one time.
Yeah.
They also talked about, because earlier, talking to the other people, the governor, that he wasn't guilty of anything. So they're gonna have to look back at it when they go for Caesar. I'm sure that they had papers saying that he's not guilty of anything. And they're gonna be held responsible because he wasn't guilty of anything to refute that dead.
It also shows the general attitude of the Roman soldier in that they were willing to just kill these prisoners rather than have them escape. Just kill them, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Protect themselves at the prisoner's expense.
Yeah. Just a couple of other thoughts. I think all those are right. But I kind of think Paul, I think he probably made quite an impression on this centurion. He was good to Paul right from the very beginning. He gave Paul the freedom to visit his friends and let them care for him. And that may have been because he's a Roman citizen, maybe that they thought really he was innocent. They didn't really feel like he was going to escape, I guess, apparently. But, Paul had given them some instructions. We shouldn't do this. This ship's going to perish. We shouldn't go. But they did it anyway. And then, he tells them that, well, the ship's going down, but none of you are going to be lost. And he said God had told him. And so I think maybe that, it's quite possible that Paul, really made quite an impression on him. Everything he said was true. They should have listened to him, and God did save him. And so here, one of the lessons I think, for us that we can apply, in times of trial, times of difficulty, we can still do the Lord's work. We can still make an impact on other people, with our behavior, the way we live our lives, by our faith in God, no matter what the circumstance is. And I think that's something we can take from Paul. No matter what was going on with Paul, whether he was, in prison or whatever, he was always doing the will of God. He was always trying to convert others. And I think that's the lesson for us. We can have a big impact on others by just doing the will of God, leading by example, how we behave, no matter what's going on. And no matter what's going on in your life, if you do that, that's always the right thing. Anybody have anything else?
Yeah, John.
Yep.
I think from what it said in the verses here that this centurion was kind to him from the beginning. Like some messages or something about Paul must have been passed on to him by the other centurion that transported him to that point.
Mm-hmm.
So he was given some information because it says he immediately was kind to him, and he never knew him till that very moment. So I think he must have got some information from
Could have been from Festus or, Agrippa or who knows, or word had gotten out, So that's a good point. Anybody have anything else? Yes.
All those people were so sick, and all of the ship people had never listened to Paul, and they all turned. They completely did a 180 and ate and did what he said. Yeah.
Yeah, they started listening to him.
And that's what we have to do to God.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. Let's read Acts chapter 28. Let's read verses 1 through 10. Now, when they had escaped, they then found out that the island was called Malta, and the natives showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and made us all welcome, because of the rain that was falling and because of the cold. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. So when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer, whom, though he just escaped the sea, yet justice does not allow to live." But he shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. However, they were expecting that he would swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had looked for a long time and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. In that region there was an estate of the leading citizen of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and entertained us courteously for 3 days. And it happened that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and dysentery. Paul went in to him and prayed, and he laid his hands on him and healed him. So when this was done, the rest of those on the island who had diseases also came and were healed. They also honored us in many ways, and when we departed, they provided such things as were necessary. So they all made it to land, some swimming, some floating on pieces of the ship, but they all made it safely. They found out they were on the island of Malta. And I think if you're curious, that's Malta. You can identify Malta on page 85 of our workbook. There's a map that shows that. But it says the natives there showed them unusual kindness. They started a fire for them. They welcomed them, because of all the rain and cold. So picture this, it is wintertime. They just been in the water. I'm sure it was cold. It was rainy. I'm sure that they were all very cold. No doubt they were miserable, and they needed some help. And these people showed kindness to them, and they helped them. And then in verse 3 says Paul had gathered some sticks for the fire, and there was a snake there. It came out because of the heat. It was a viper, so it's a poisonous snake. It was venomous, a deadly snake, and it bit Paul and was hanging on his hand. So they're thinking this guy, he must be a murderer, because he escapes this shipwreck only to be bitten by a snake and die. So they're thinking that justice does not allow him to live. But Paul shook off the snake into the fire. They watched, they were expecting him to die, but only to realize that he wasn't harmed. And so then they changed their minds. They didn't think he was a murderer anymore. They thought maybe he was some sort of god. So then in verse 7, it says there was a chief official there. And my understanding is he had an estate there near the shore. His name was Publius. And he welcomed them and treated them well. He took care of them for about 3 days. Paul found out that Publius's father was ill of fever and dysentery, and he went and laid hands on him and healed him. And so when others heard about this, many other people that were sick came and were healed by Paul as well. So it says they were very appreciative, and it says they honored them in many ways. And when they finally departed, they provided them with all the necessities. Anybody have anything there?
Their ship must have was all crushed. So they must have given them a ship.
Yeah, well, we'll see that they're going to get on there's another ship that's going to be sailing towards that Rome that I guess that wintered there, and they're going to get on that ship and go to Rome. Yes.
I think, well, instead of a ship, I think probably what they were giving was the things that they needed just to live. They didn't carry any clothes off that shipwreck. They're just wearing what they've got.
Right.
And so this guy provides what they need just to get along until they can get off the island.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Very good. Okay, let's read the last. Let's read the last verses here, verses 11 through 16. After 3 months, we sailed in an Alexandrian ship whose figurehead was the twin brothers which had wintered at the island. And landing at Syracuse, we stayed 3 days. From there, we circled round and reached Rhegium. And after 1 day, the south wind blew, and the next day we came to Puteoli, where we found brethren and were invited to stay with them 7 days. And so we went toward Rome. And from there, when the brethren heard about us, they came to meet us far as Apiforum and 3 Inns. When Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. Now, when we came to Rome, the centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard, but Paul was permitted to dwell by himself with the soldier who guarded him. So we see in verse 11, they stayed in Malta for 3 months. Then they sailed on another ship that had wintered there. It was an Alexandrian ship, and it said it had the twin heads, gods, as its figureheads. And so I had to Google this and found out that the twin gods here is a reference to the twin sons of Zeus and Leda. Okay, their names were Castor and Pollux. So it was believed that they were protectors of sailors. So many of these ancient ships would place their figureheads on them, and it was supposed to protect them against the storms. But of course, we know the reality is the one true God was the one that protected Paul. But in verse 12, it says they first stopped in Syracuse, where they stayed for 3 days. Then they sailed across to Rhegium. They sailed up the coast to Puteoli, where it says they found some believers who invited them to spend a week with them. And so then they came to Rome. So in verse 15, it says, brothers and sisters in Rome, the members of the church there, heard they were coming, and they went to meet them, greet them there. And when Paul saw this, he was encouraged and thanked God. And then in verse 16, at Rome, Paul was permitted to have his private lodging there and was guarded by a sailor. So in the minutes that we have left, I just kind of want to go over maybe some practical lessons that we can take from this story, something that we can take and apply. So I'll open it up. What practical lessons do y'all see that we can take from this story?
I'm thinking about all those people he was with, all those prisoners that most likely were hardened criminals. And he was such an educated man. You know he was a target. I don't know how he lived through it.
Yeah.
So when times are tough, as they were in high school.
Yeah. So one thing that I was thinking about here is, who are you listening to? Are you listening to the world? Are you listening to men? We need to be careful who we're listening to. First and foremost, we need to listen to God. We need to listen to what the Word says. Listening to the wrong sources is going to get you in trouble. We know that God's Word is always right. That's really who we need to be listening to and consulting and praying. We know God's Word. Pray to Him and follow Him. He's always right. That's always the right thing to do. So that was, one thing that I was thinking about. What else? Anybody have anything else? Yes, Bill?
As difficult as the situation was that Paul was in, he trusted in God.
Mm-hmm. You're right. And that kind of leads me to something else. I think it would have been easy for Paul and all of them really to be discouraged, but he wasn't. Discouragement's a choice, really. I think it would have been easy to be discouraged and to give up. When the storm was battering the ship, many had given up. They'd given up all hope. And Paul certainly had every reason to be discouraged, but Paul, with the help of God, he didn't give up. He led with God's help. He led. And so I think there's a lesson there for us, no matter what life throws at you, rely on God. He can help. Don't give up. If you're faithful and you pray to God, God will be near. Keep your faith. Don't get discouraged. Don't get lukewarm. Don't take your eyes off Him. In Romans 8:28, it says all things work together for good for those who love God. So that was something else. There was another thought that I had, and it was care by other Christians for Paul on his journey. And this is something, certainly that we can do. We're God's children, and when we come in contact with other Christians, they're our brothers and sisters. We should treat them as such. We should show care for them and help them, provide for them, especially when they have need. That's something that I see in this story, with Paul in his circumstances. There were others that came to his aid and helped him. And it says it encouraged him. That's certainly something that we can do and we can take from this lesson as well. Another thought, that I had was, God is in control. God is always in control. He controls everything. He controls the seas. He controls the wind. We can put our trust in Him. Always doing His will, no matter what the circumstances. God can protect us. We need to rely on Him and pray to Him and trust in Him. We can always be doing God's will and have an effect on people, no matter what circumstance that we're in. We can always do that. What else? Yes, Paul.
And you think about Paul, he was there. Yeah, if they would let fear take over, it could have been a totally different outcome. If Paul was there to keep them looking towards God and keeping the fear from not overtaking what was going on.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Anybody have anything else there? Any thoughts?
And it comes down to the whole thing too, God always gives us a way out. At the very end of that, He gave everybody on that ship an escape. He said, if you can swim, get ashore. Those that didn't, it said they wrote, whatever, a piece of wood or whatever it was to get there. He gives us a way out of those things. And we take that for granted, I think, a lot too.
Yeah, I certainly think that He always gives us a way of escape for sin. I do, think that for sure,
Paul faced one crisis after another. That's a good lesson for us. You know, we have one crisis and we throw in the towel. But he had crisis after crisis after crisis. So it should be a lesson for us in that persevere, keep carrying on. And I know sometimes we think it's the easiest thing to do, just give up.
I think that's a big lesson for us right there is perseverance, continuing no matter what the circumstance, continuing to serve God, no matter what's thrown at you, no matter what circumstance, difficulties, trials that you may have, always trusting in Him and persevering. I think that's a big lesson, for us, that we can take from this.
Following God is not always going to be easy.
Mm-hmm. No, there's going to be trials. There's going to be difficulties for sure. It's not always going to be easy.
The way Carol hates snakes, that would have done her in.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Was it necessary for Paul to go through this simply for the fact that what he had caused previous in killing the Christians, then he had to go through that?
That's a good question. If that may be true, that he may have been going through all of that. I don't know. That's a good thought. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, there's always consequences for our behaviors, whether we're sorry or not. We still suffer consequences for our behaviors, so I think it's possible.
Yeah. Yes.
My only thought on that is, Paul persecuted the Christians before he was baptized. Baptism forgives all previous sin. Now, I don't deny that probably weighed heavily
Yeah, it did.
on Paul, but he'd been forgiven for that.
He had been for sure, but something that we can learn is that just because we're forgiven, that doesn't mean that we don't suffer any consequences from those past sins.
People didn't forget.
Yeah, people didn't forget, and sometimes we have to live with those consequences of those past sins for sure. So, all right, thank you all for your comments and input. Thank you.